Hello, my name is Paul Connett, and hello Australia. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is not good timing, as you know, and this evening will serve two purposes. One, I hope I can communicate the real concerns I have about the science of the fact that fluoride damages the brain. That's for you. But this is all being videotaped. And many of our meetings now in Australia have already been cancelled. All our 3 presentations were cancelled in Melbourne this afternoon. So we are expecting more cancellations. So with this videotape, we'll have to serve instead of my talk. So I thank you for being here and being helpful. So as an audience, you can make a lot of noise when you need to. So to start the talk, you see the subtitle there. Science versus denial. In this presentation, most of what I have to say is science, and we have a lot of backup for that science. You've got a leaflet there which summarizes all the key studies. Let me say that the science that's been published since September 2017 is devastating as far as the implications for the mental development of our children. Published in September of 2017. Anything that's been said before then by the NHMRC, by health officers, by any doctor is totally outdated. And so your task today is to see how much of that science you can understand. But in addition to the science, I'm going to try to put this into some kind of historical perspective, and certainly into the perspective of when I first got involved with this issue in 1996. So there's some history here, and a lot of that history has to do with the juxtaposition of the scientific developments and the way that that science has been mishandled and misrepresented by health agencies in the handful of countries which fluoridate. Not many countries fluoridate, as you probably know. Australia, New Zealand, England 10%, Ireland, mandatory, Canada, up to 40%, United States, 70-odd%, not many other countries. And the health departments and various scientific bodies and professional bodies in those countries have let us down. Anyway, now to begin proper. This tour has been organized by Fluoride Free Australia. Please make sure you go to this webpage frequently. It's linked to ours, so anything that we do, they are happy to pick up. The next person I want to acknowledge is Chris Neuran. Chris Neuran is our Senior Research Officer, and he has put together a really good PowerPoint, very scientific PowerPoint, on everything I'm talking about. So I have melded a more layperson's version of this with some of his slides. So thanks to Chris. Here is Chris. This is Chris Neuran. This is Bill Hersey, an opponent of fluoridation. He was a senior scientist at the US EPA. He was the one that organized the scientists at the EPA to oppose fluoridation. Wonderful guy, in his 80s now. We might hear a little bit more about him later on. This is Quanyong Zhang, who wrote one of the pivotal papers from China on the IQ issue. A very, very important paper, and we'll have more to say about him. Then this person is my wife, and she got me into this in 1996. 3 people around the United States and Canada had asked me to get involved with this when I was fighting incinerators, promoting zero waste, which I still do, had approached me and asked, why don't you get involved with fluoridation? I said, take that away, these people are crazy. And that's what I said to my wife when she put these papers on my desk. And she says, please read it. I said, why? I said, these people are crazy. And she says, read it. They have a village council meeting this afternoon, and they're going to decide whether they're going to continue this thing. And I need you to tell me whether I should be urging them to continue or to stop. She said, well, I did. I read it. I was absolutely shocked and humbled that I had fallen for the trap of believing that those opposed to fluoridation were crazy people. Some are, but there are crazy people on the other side as well. It doesn't matter. The question is, what does the science say, in my view? So she got me involved, and she remains the absolute rock on which the Fluoride Adhd network operates. She is the treasurer, the secretary, she runs the web page, she keeps everything up to date, she keeps everybody on their toes, including me. I think I would have walked away from this issue many years ago had she not kept me in shape. And you'll hear more about him in a moment. This is my youngest son, Michael. We always hoped that one of our children would grow up to be activists. And we had no idea that one would grow up not only to be an activist, but better than we were on practically everything to do with activism, writing, researching, all the technological stuff and everything else. Anyway, I'll come back to him in a moment because he features very much towards the end of my presentation. So my personal involvement, again, I'm a professor of chemistry. I specialize in environmental chemistry and toxicology. I have spent the last 24 years researching fluoride's toxicity. And when I first got involved in 1996, it coincided with a couple of things. First of all, it was a year after a major animal study had been published by Phyllis Molyneux. And this was a study on animal behavior. She had developed a whole technique of investigating whether animals are hyperactive or hypoactive. And computerized video animal movements. So anyway, marvelous technique. And she found that animals, rats, exposed to fluoride before they were born were hyperactive, and rats exposed after they were born were hypoactive. When the Forsyth Dental Center, for which she was the chairman of the toxicology department, knew that her study was published, they fired her. They fired her in 1985 and said, "Your work is no longer relevant to dentistry." That's what she said. She was the first chairman of a toxicology department in the United States. And they fired her. Her job was to investigate the neurotoxicity of chemicals used in dentistry. The first one they gave her was fluoride, and to her absolute amazement, it turned out to be damaging to the brain. And a year later, in 1996, we had two studies by then published in English for the first time. These were Chinese studies, but they were published in English. It's since turned out that there were many more Chinese studies, and we, the Fluoride Adhd Network, has subsequently had those translated into English, which turns out to be rather significant. So right from the word go, I was trying to dig up a paper I wrote in 1995 for Waste Note, which my wife was editing at that point, in which I said, almost game over, who possibly could justify trying to protect children's teeth, saving a few teeth, at the expense of damaging their brains? That's what my conclusion in 1996. And there were only 2 IQ studies. So now we can start the history. What has happened since 1996? Well, let's run to the present. As of this year, there are now 72 fluoride IQ studies have been published. 64 of these have found a lowered IQ, intelligence quotient, associated with higher fluoride exposure. In most of these studies, from China, Iran, India, Mexico, they compared the IQ of children in villages with high fluoride exposure versus children in villages with low fluoride exposure. In some cases, the fluoride exposure was from coal burning in China. Some homes cook with coal, heat their homes with coal, dry their food with coal, and so on. But most of the studies that have been done have been with natural fluoride in the water. High natural fluoride versus low natural fluoride. 8 have not found this association. So an overwhelming number, 64 versus 8. And even some of the 8 that didn't find a statistical difference found a difference. So they're not all completely negative. And most of these studies, as I said, have been done in China, but they've also been conducted in India, Iran, Mexico, New Zealand, that's a relatively recent one, and more recently in Canada since 2017. And on our webpage, fluorideadhd.org, there is a complete compilation of these, actually 64 studies. They're the beginning, and this is what my wife has done. She's gone through all 64 studies, described them, linked to them. In some cases we have the full paper, in some cases we have the abstract, but you will get full explanations of every single study. We have developed the largest database on fluoride's neurotoxicity as well as fluoride's health effects in the world. A citizens group, this makes me angry, a citizens group has had to do what your government should be doing, what the NHMRC should have been doing, but they haven't. The amount of science on the health of communities that are fluoridated that has been actually done in fluoridated communities is disgustingly little. Most of the studies have been done in countries that don't want fluoride, like China and India. They've got millions of people overexposed to fluoride. They have an interest of finding out the truth. Their interest is to get the fluoride out of the water, as opposed to our countries that have an interest in continuing this practice that they started in 1945 and don't have the wherewithal to admit they made a mistake. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. So here are some of the key papers. There are more, but these are the ones I'd like to focus on this evening. Zhang 2003, that's the Zhang that you saw the photo of. Choi 2012, this is otherwise known as the Harvard Review. Bashash 2017, this is the turning point. This is the paper that was published in 2017 and changes the whole ballgame. But there's more. There's a green study from 2019. That was from Canada. Bashash study was done in Mexico City, but it was done by an American and Canadian as well as Mexican researchers. Green essentially reproduced the Bashash findings. Very important. Then we have another very important study published just a couple of months ago by Till, again from Canada. So, Mexico, China, Mexico City, Canada, Canada. And then we have a review by the National Toxicology Program, which has only reached a draft stage. We requested that review in 2016. Philippe Grandjean, who's at Harvard, was part of the Choi review from 2012. He's written an excellent summary of the science. For scientists watching out there, you should read that paper. It's very comprehensive. Then we have studies on ADHD. Malin in 2015. Bashash, the same as the Bashash 2017, they also looked at ADHD. And Riddle in 2019. And just in case you'll fall asleep before I get there, this study shows 3 times the rate of ADHD amongst children in fluoridated communities in Canada versus non-fluoridated. 300% higher prevalence of ADHD amongst children who've grown up in fluoridated versus non-fluoridated communities. If that isn't a bombshell, what is? And another study, I don't know if this is technically neurotoxicity, but sleep patterns in adults apparently have also been disturbed by fluoride. Anyway, I'm going to go through all of those now. That's the route map we're taking. Fluoride and IQ. In 2006, the National Research Council in the United States produced this 500-page report with about 1,100 references. It is the most comprehensive review of the toxicology of fluoride in water. I'm happy to say I testified before them, and much of what I put in my testimony was examined in this report. In this report, they had a whole chapter on neurotoxicity. And this is what they said about fluoride and the brain. It is apparent that fluorides have the ability to interfere with the functions of the brain. This is based on animal studies and on human studies. Very significant. So 2006 was important. But I want to stress to you that they only had, at that time, 5 IQ studies available for review. So they're pretty good that they actually took those 5 studies, plus the animal studies, and said we have a problem here. But largely ignored. Ignored by the EPA. So there we are, they have got the denial. The denial here was the Environmental Protection Agency, which continues to defend fluoridation in the United States, plays interference for the National Institute of Health. The National Institute of Health promotes fluoridation using the vehicle of the Center for Disease Control, except it's misleading because it's only the oral health division of the Center for Disease Control, which is about 30 people out of 30,000 people. They promote fluoridation. Not many other people at CDC are tracking the health effects. We've got this one agency that promotes it. And playing interference for them is the US EPA. The EPA actually requested the NRC in 2003 to do this review. And the review came back and said, your safe drinking water standard is too high. You need to lower it. You need to do a new risk assessment. That was in 2006. The EPA has still not lowered this ridiculous 4 parts per million standard, has still not done a risk assessment. The 2006 to 14 years of denial from the EPA. And we are suing them, and that will be at the end of the talk. Okay, so we got to Zhang 2003. Okay, let's switch from the science for a moment for denial. Let's see what the NHMRC said about this in 2007. When the NHMRC came out with their report, there were 2 volumes. One volume was their analysis, which largely copied the York Review from 2000. And then another volume was all the studies they excluded. Right from the get-go, they excluded all the animal studies. Right from the get-go, they didn't take any notice of the NRC review, which was published in 2006. But I want you to see what they say about Zhang, because in a moment we're going to watch and look at this paper. The Zhang paper was excluded. Why? Because it was the wrong intervention. There were no low or optimal fluoride group. Final status excluded. You'll find it on page 428. Okay, that's how the NHMRC treated the paper that I'm about to show you. Zhang compared 2 villages. I've since been to those 2 villages. The low fluoride village, look at the range here. 0.36 parts per million. You fluoridate in Australia, what about 0.7, 0.8?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is no low or optimal village. The range is 0.18 to 0.76. This is low and at the levels that you're using. It's exactly the study you want. That's the low fluoride village. And then you've got a high fluoride village where the average is 2.5, but again the range 0.57 to 4.5. So that's completely inaccurate what the NHMRC put there. And they knocked out this important paper. We go on. What they found is that it was a good study. They controlled for lead, they controlled for iodine. In retrospectively, they were controlled for arsenic. They found a drop of 5 to 10 IQ points across the whole age range between the two villages. And you can see how the IQ curve has been shifted over. This is for males, but it's similar for females. Now the blue line is the low fluoride village, the magenta line is the high fluoride village. You can see the whole curve has been shifted over, which means fewer very intelligent children above 130 and more children below 70, which makes them mentally handicapped. The whole shift of the curve over, I'll come back to that, the significance of that later. But in addition to comparing the two villages en masse, high fluoride versus low fluoride, they also broke down the high fluoride village into 5 groups, A, B, C, D, and E. F is the low fluoride village. And the other village, A, B, C, D, E, is the high fluoride village, and they split it up into ranges of concentration. So A, subgroup A, 0.75 parts per million on average. Subgroup B, 1.5 parts per million. C, 2.5. D, 3. E, 4. And then they looked at the average IQ in those villages, those subgroups. And you see how systematically the IQ is coming down as the fluoride levels go up. In other words, you've got a dose response. As the fluoride levels in these subgroups goes up, the average IQ of the children go down. And if you look at that, you would say, if that was all the data you would have, you would say that the IQ must be lowered somewhere between 0.75 and 1.5. That gives you absolutely no safety margin whatsoever for children in Australia. But the NHMRC excluded that study. They did another thing. They looked at the percentage of children in those 5 subgroups that were borderline mentally handicapped. But between 70 and 80, you're borderline handicapped. Below 70, you're definitely mentally handicapped. And notice, as the fluoride levels go up, the percentage of children in this range of being mentally handicapped goes up from here you've got 10%, which is not statistically significant, but here you're up to 15, 21, 37.5. And again, you can plot that. There's another dose-response relationship. In these subgroups, the higher the fluoride concentration, the more children are in the mentally handicapped group. Okay, we'll keep the clock running. By 2010, there are now 23 IQ studies have been published. 23. And we had, by this time, FAN had been translating these, many of these Chinese studies. That's what jacks this number up. All these studies were not published, but identified and discussed in our book, which was published in 2010. That's our book, The Case Against Fluoride. 3 professors wrote this: myself, retired professor of chemistry; James Beck, retired professor of physics; and Spenning Micklem, a retired professor of biology. 80 pages of references. Okay. Then in 2012, another breakthrough for us. This team from Harvard did what is called a meta-analysis. They did a meta-analysis of 27 studies. Because the methodology used in all these studies was essentially the same, comparing the IQ of children exposed to high fluoride versus children exposed to low fluoride, all the same methodology, you can add them all together and make a sort of average out the change of IQ. So 25 of these studies came from China and 2 from Iran. It was published in Environmental Health Perspectives, which is one of the leading environmental health journals in the United States. Now, the Harvard team acknowledged that the methodologies of a number of these studies was rather weak. There was more information that they needed. However, they also concluded that the results were remarkably consistent. In 26 of the 27 studies, the average IQ in the high fluoride village was lower than the low fluoride village by an average of 7 IQ points. Now, what makes this remarkable is these studies were done over a period of 20 years. They were done by different research teams and in different geographical areas in China, all over China. And yet, despite all those variations, different research teams, different times, different areas of China, you've got this remarkable consistency. Here are the studies. You can see the top one was 1989, the bottom one was 2011. This review was published in 2012. And what they found was, if you averaged all out, there was a drop of half a standard deviation. A standard deviation for the IQ curve is 14 IQ points. So half a standard deviation is 7 IQ points, or thereabouts. 7 IQ points. Now, unfortunately, promoters of fluoridation got this wrong. They said it was only a drop of less than 1 IQ point, not 1 standard deviation, not less than 1 standard, a drop of half a standard deviation, a drop of half an IQ point. No, no, no. It was a drop of 7 IQ points. Okay, and you notice that Zhang, 2003, is among these studies. Okay, now forward to 2014. We had Zhang over to give a talk at our annual our fan conference in Washington, D.C. We took advantage of his visit to go with Chris Neurath, our senior researcher, and Bill Hersley, a senior scientist retired from the EPA, to go to the Office of Water Division. And we said to the Office of Water Division, you are telling the public that the most sensitive endpoint to fluoride's exposure is severe dental fluorosis. This researcher here has examined the IQ of hundreds of children in China, and his results show that children with less than severe dental fluorosis, not just severe, but moderate and mild, have, or very mild, have a loss of IQ. So how can you say that severe dental fluorosis is the most sensitive endpoint when you've got loss of IQ for children who obviously have less exposure to it? Yeah, well, I should say, the severity of dental fluorosis is very clearly an indicator of how much fluoride the kid was exposed to. More fluoride exposure, more severe dental fluorosis. So that is not disputed. Oh, and the new deputy director of the EPA Water Division was there, and he said, okay, well, I must study this, I will look into this, I'll get back to you. After 2 years, nothing. Bill kept phoning on the phone, nothing. And of course, no changes, no acknowledgement by the EPA that they had to look at the neurotoxicity of fluoride. No, nothing, nada. Denied. Now, proponents of fluoridation have only offered one significant human study that they say negates all the other human studies that have found a lowering of IQ associated with fluoride exposure. And that's the study from New Zealand by Broadbent. There is another study that they're referring to. It's not a very weighty study from Sweden, and that's not really taken seriously by many people. But the Broadbent study has been used essentially as the counter to all that we've been saying, Broadbent. But let's have a look at Broadbent. In our view, it's fatally flawed. Why? Because it was a retrospective study. This was long after the event. There was a study done at Dunedin university where they had the data from going back many years, maybe 30 years, of children who'd grown up in Dunedin and children who lived outside Dunedin. And they used this cohort for this study. The trouble was, they had 991 children who'd grown up in the water fluoridated area, but only 99 in the non-fluoridated area. And then in addition to that, they didn't take into account that the children in the non-fluoridated area were likely to have been given fluoride supplements. So what they should have done was to compare the total fluoride exposure from both supplements and water, or vice versa, and compare that. So in reality, when people looked at the data, there was very little difference in the total intake of fluoride between these two groups. So the study really lacked any rigor. And further complicating the study is the fact that New Zealanders are very high tea drinkers. And tea is another source of fluoride, a significant source of fluoride. So that is ignored. So not a very strong study, in our view. But in comes the NHMRC in 2017. And they published this paper, referred to by your health officer, Mr. Cook. And what did they have in there? This is the review by NHMRC, which is being cited now to citizens throughout Australia as evidence that there's no health effects from fluoride. Okay. Information paper, water fluoridation, dental and other human health outcomes. July of 2017. National Health and Medical Research Council. This is an arm of government, right? This is part of the federal government in Canberra. So what's the problem with this? First of all, they only referenced about 15 of at least 50 IQ studies which were available to them in July of 2017. They do not refer to the Harvard meta-analysis from 2012, which looked at 27 of the studies. They again ignored the Zhang 2003 study. And believe it or not, they gave Broadbent a high-quality rating with a low risk of bias. This is what they say. And then they used, having done that, then they used this Broadbent study to underpin the #1 finding that they are to share with the Australian public. Here it comes. You ready for it? The evidence from a single study of an acceptable quality shows that there is no association between water fluoridation at current Australian levels and the cognitive function of children or adults. And that is based upon Broadbent, this wonky study. And then, I could argue that some more, but then a few months later, that report from the NHMRC came out in July of 2017. On September the 19th, 2017 came the bombshell. The bombshell was Bashash 2017. This study again appeared in Environmental Health Perspectives. There's a lot we need to say about this study. #1, it was a 12-year, multi-million-dollar study funded by the EPA, the NIH, and the NIEHS. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, promotes fluoridation. NIH, National Institutes of Health. Overall, they promote fluoridation in the shape of the Center for Disease Control, and finally, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences. The authors came from many prestigious universities and institutions: Toronto, McGill, Harvard, Indiana, Michigan, Mount Sinai, and more. So very well established, and they had to be. They got to get a multi-million-dollar grant from the NIH, you have to jump through a lot of hoops. What do they find? They examined approximately 300 mother-offspring pairs. This whole study is based upon individual measurements. the weaknesses of all the other studies that we've talked about, they've been community-based, so-called ecological studies. You only measure what's in the community, in the water supply in this village versus that village. In this case, we're going to look at 300 mother pair individuals. 300 mothers are going to be measured for their fluoride exposure, and their offspring are going to be measured for their IQ. Okay, got the idea? So here we go. Both exposures and outcomes were determined on an individual basis. That makes it a very strong study. The mother's exposure to fluoride during pregnancy was determined by analysis of their urine. Now, the importance of this is the urine is a measure of the woman's total exposure. It doesn't matter if it came from toothpaste, or tea, or water, or food, or salt. In Mexico, they actually fluoridate the salt. It doesn't matter. What matters is we've got a measurement of the total exposure that that woman had during pregnancy. They controlled for everything under the sun. Again, this goes back, if you're funded by the NIH, you've got to demonstrate that you've thought of everything. And they thought of practically everything in terms of controls. The study results. The IQ of the women's children was measured at age 4 and again to 6 to 12. So you measure the mother's exposure and then the infant's IQ. For every 1 milligram per litre increase in the mother's urine, the children lost an average of 5 to 6 IQ points. That is very significant, as we'll see in a moment. Now, this is what we believe is the range of fluoride in the urine of women in the United States, from 0.5 to 1.5. That is a 1 milligram per litre change, and there we're getting a loss of 5 to 6 IQ points. Very significant. This is how they summarized the study. In this study, higher levels of maternal urinary fluoride during pregnancy, a proxy for prenatal exposure, pre-birth, that are in the range of levels of exposure in other general population samples of pregnant women as well as non-pregnant adults, were associated with lower scores on tests of cognitive function in the offspring at 4 and to 6 to 12 years of age. This is now we got the denial. This is the ADA. 1 minute after this paper was published, the ADA was interviewed by a Canadian newspaper. Obviously, they got a pre-copy, and the journalist knew it was coming out at precisely the time, so they were ready to make a statement. The American Dental Association examined a study of environmental health perspectives based on fluoride intake in Mexico and concludes the findings are not applicable to the United States. The ADA continues to endorse fluoridation of public water as the most effective public health measure. You know, they've said this 100 times, 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times since 1945. Any health problem that comes up, it's not a problem. Denial. And to say it's not relevant to other countries is nonsense, because it was based upon the exposure to the mother as measured in their urine. It had nothing to do with Mexico City as such. This is what the author said, the prime author, the leader of the research team from Toronto. It says, Dr. Howard, this is a very rigorous epidemiological study. You just can't deny it. It's directly related to whether fluoride is a risk for the neurodevelopment of children. So to say it has no relevance to the folks of the United States seems disingenuous, rather gentle, the very scientific dismissal of the ADA. But within a few weeks, a study was published in Canada where they looked at the fluoride levels in the urine of women. In the fluoridated areas, the average was 0.87 parts per million. The average in the Mexico City study was 0.91. Essentially identical. So to say that this finding was not relevant to North America, not relevant to Canada, not relevant to the United States is nonsense. But you can forget that, because within a few more months we get the Green Study, which essentially replicated the Bashesh findings. This is CHRIS now, High Quality Mother Offspring Longitudinal Cohort Study, Canada. That's the official way you describe this. Again, it was the association between maternal fluoride exposure, the levels of fluoride in the urine of pregnant women, and the offspring of their children. Now there's one difference which the proponents have made a big thing about, and that is that the IQ loss in this case was only observed in the boys and not the girls. 4.5 IQ loss was found for 1 milligram per liter increase. Now, that said, as I said, the proponents have made a big thing of this. They've used this to cast doubt on the whole study. But the authors did 2 other measurements, and one of the other measurements was calculating the fluoride intake that the mother had in milligrams versus the IQ. And in this case, the average IQ loss of 3.7 points for each milligram per day increase in the mother's ingestion. In that case, it was for both boys and girls. So a very, very powerful study, and importantly, it was published in a very important journal. It was published in JAMA Pediatrics, JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association, Pediatrics, the most important journal on pediatrics in the world. And they went to town. They knew that they were going to get a lot of criticism of this. This is a very controversial issue. So the authors, the editors, made sure that the research material was examined. It was given very tight peer review, probably twice as much as normal. They went through the statistical analysis. They published an editorial in the same journal that this came out, explaining this. They also had a review article by David Bellinger in the same journal, where he's commenting on the significance of this. Bellinger is a world-famous neurotoxicologist in lead. Okay, and then in addition to that, and you can listen to it, there is a 10-minute podcast where the editor of JAMA overall and the editor of JAMA Pediatrics discuss this finding. And it's very revealing. They say things like, this is a shocking study. We were always taught that fluoridation was safe and effective, had no idea it could possibly damage the brain. Well, where have they been? You know, since 1996 we've been talking about these studies from China. But anyway, they had to catch up. But at the end of the conversation, one of them says, well, I have to say, if my wife was pregnant, I would advise her not to drink fluoridated water. We got a fabulous press coverage for this. The biggest, I think we had more press attention to this article than any other. But the pros managed to obfuscate many of the issues. There were a lot of incorrect accusations and incorrect interpretations of the paper. But it didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Because the New York Times didn't cover it. We got a lot of coverage throughout the world, but we didn't get coverage in the New York Times. And in science, if the New York Times doesn't cover a scientific issue, it doesn't happen. It's amazing how much respect people pay to this newspaper, even though their report performance on fluoridation has been shoddy. In fact, the science editor of the New York Times, a guy called McNeil, is the son of the Donald McNeil who wrote a book on the wonderful achievement of water fluoridation. So he must have got this bias from his dad. But the editor of the New York Times is on record to say the issue of fluoride's toxicity was resolved years ago. not much of a scientist. No scientist would say that. No issue in science is ever resolved. You always have to entertain that an ugly fact is going to destroy a beautiful theory. And that's exactly what's happened with fluoridation. So, editor's advice: pregnant mothers should avoid fluoridated water. Now I want to digress for just a couple of seconds and explain to you why a drop of 5 IQ points, or thereabouts, 5 IQ points, is so significant on the population level. Don't forget that water fluoridation is a practice which is designed to reach the whole population, every man, woman and child. That's the idea of putting in the water. You give it to everybody. Well, this is the danger of lowering the IQ across the board. Here's your typical normal distribution curve. Any human trait, whether it's intelligent, height, whatever, follows a normal distribution curve, such that at one extreme you have very heavy people, one other extreme you have very light people, and most people are an average weight. In IQ, you've got some people who are very bright, and some people are very handicapped, but most people will cluster around a central issue. That's called the bell-shaped curve. All right, let me take this a bit further. The above an IQ of 130 are very bright children. So this green area represents the children of your population which are very bright, which includes geniuses up here. That fraction, that green area is the fraction of your total, which is an IQ above 130. And down here is the fraction with an IQ less than 70. These are intellectually impaired. Now, if you shift the whole curve over by 5 IQ points, which is what we're doing with fluoridation, roughly, you wouldn't notice the impact on the average child. If you were a parent and you had 2 children, one had an IQ of 100 and the other one had 90, you wouldn't know. You wouldn't know. Nor would a school teacher. You wouldn't know until somebody did a test to see what their IQs were. And so this is not noticeable as far as the average person is concerned. But look how noticeable it is in the 2 tails. You literally halve the area under the curve. You literally halve the number of children, the fraction of children who are very bright in your society, and you increase by about, to be accurate, 57% increase in the number of children that are intellectually handicapped. That has huge significance for the economy of a modern country. If you decrease by 50% the number of kids who are very bright, these are the kids who lead industry, these are the kids that invent things, etc., etc., etc. And you put an enormous economic burden on your social services in many different ways by increasing the number of children who are mentally handicapped. And there's more. Till 2020, this is just a few months ago. This was published in Environmental International. It contains Rivka Green, who did the Green Study from 2019. Christine Teal was the one that measured fluoride in the urine throughout Canada. And Bruce Lanphier is another of the world's great toxicologists on lead. Remember some of these names because I'm going to mention them again. Now, what did they find? High quality mother-offspring longitudinal cohort study, fluoride in infant formula, dramatic lowering of IQ. This is another study from Canada. And again, it is another bombshell study because what they found was a large difference in IQ between children who as babies were bottle-fed in fluoridated communities versus children who were bottle-fed in non-fluoridated communities. So in other words, the only difference we're looking at is what happens to the IQ of a child who's bottle fed with fluoridated water versus a child who's bottle fed with non-fluoridated water. We're not comparing versus breastfed. We are comparing bottle fed in both cases. Not many other differences in this study that you can see. And what did they find? A very large loss of IQ with increasing tap water. 9 IQ points for each milligram per litre increase in tap water fluoride. 9 IQ points. And in the case of performance scale, which is known as non-verbal, if your IQ study is based upon non-verbal as opposed to verbal, it goes up to a whacking 19 IQ points. Again, this is a bombshell, just the difference of bottle feeding your baby with fluoridated versus tap water. And now in terms of my personal history, these are slides. John, you were here my last time I was here. You would have seen these slides before. I use them practically have been for a long time. Because it was so striking to me in 1996 when I found that the level of fluoride in mother's milk was incredibly low, 0.004 parts per million. That didn't make sense to me. If you're telling me that a baby needs fluoride to protect its teeth when they erupt, then why on earth is it not in mother's milk? Why hasn't nature provided fluoride for the baby in baby's first meal? Now compare that number, 0.004. In effect, mother's milk protects the infant from fluoride exposure. That's what I'm saying. But look at the range of fluoride in the United States, 0.7 to 1.2. Look at the ratio. It's 175 to 300 times the level in mother's milk. And I think that was absurd. I thought it was absurd in 1996 to give our babies about 200 times more fluoride than a mother would give with breastfeeding. It didn't make sense to me. Now, 24 years later, we're getting the evidence of what a terrible mistake this was in terms of the brain. Now, fluoride ADHD. Made until back in 2015, yes. They compared the prevalence of ADHD by state. They plotted the prevalence of ADHD, for which they had official figures for each state, against the percentage of the state that was fluoridated. So these states over here are more fluoridated, these states down here are less fluoridated. They did this for 3 years, 2011, 2007, and 2003. And you notice in each of those years, as the percentage of the state fluoridated goes up, the prevalence of ADHD goes up. Well, this study received a lot of criticism, methodology, etc. But then in 2018, Bashash, who did that IQ study that I told you about, the turning point, Bashash found the same thing. He found that the more the woman was exposed to fluoride during pregnancy, the more ADHD, significant increase in ADHD's total score with higher maternal fluoride levels. Another high-quality study funded by the US regulatory agencies. And then finally, we get another bombshell. This is the Riddle Study. I've already referred to this study, Riddle. What have they found here? Almost 300% higher risk of ADHD for those living in fluoridated areas in a national sample of Canadian children. And it went up even higher for each 1 milligram per litre increase in that water. Incredible! That makes water fluoridation the highest risk factor for ADHD in Canada. Incredible. And fluoride in sleep patterns, I just mentioned this. Malin, again, that's, you've seen her name before, Malin and Till. These Canadians have really broken the back of this issue. But they showed that altered sleep patterns in adolescents linked to levels of fluoride in the drinking water. They used national data, and they referred back to animal studies done by Jennifer Luke from England, and I've talked about this for years, showed that animals exposed to fluoride had lowered melatonin production and reached earlier puberty in animal studies. So there is some animal evidence, experimental evidence, to support this particular finding about sleep patterns, because sleep patterns depend upon melatonin levels. Okay, now we get to the NTP review of 2019. And in 2016, we, the Fluoride Action Network, requested the US National Toxicology Program. We were anxious to get some scientific body to look at all the stuff that we were sharing on the internet with all our activists in Australia, New Zealand, and Ireland, England, all over the world. We are sharing this information. EPA is not listening to us. The CDC is not listening to us. Can we get another agency to look at this? Well, the National Toxicology Program is such an agency that does, as close to you can get, independent reviews, although in this case they serve the EPA and the CDC and the FDA. They serve three big regulatory bodies. And unfortunately, that means you have the potential of the CDC interceding. May have happened here. Anyway, the National Toxicology Program systematic review was published in draft form at the end of last year, and their conclusion, NTP concludes that fluoride is presumed to be a cognitive neurodevelopmental hazard to humans. This conclusion is based upon a consistent pattern of findings in human studies across several different populations, showing that higher fluoride exposure is associated with decreased IQ or other cognitive impairments in children. Exactly what we've been saying, and now it was vindicated by the National Toxicology Program. Oh, and incidentally, this is the grading of the Broadbent study. Remember that Broadbent study that was supposed to, NHMRC was the one that showed that all the others were crap? Well, the yellow bars represent high risk of bias. The Broadbent study was a high risk of bias on three different labels, in terms of selection, in terms of confounding, and in terms of detection. High risk of bias. You only actually have to read the study to see how biased Broadbent is. Well, I'll tell you the story. I was in New Zealand in, I think it was 2014, on a tour. I'd been interviewed on television. I said, well, the concern we have is the lowering of IQ. Thank you very much, Dr. Connett disappeared. The next night, Broadbent was on television. Oh, he said, this is all nonsense. This is based upon crappy Chinese studies. We've done a wonderful study, high quality study, down in Dunedin, which will be published shortly. He knocked, if you like, he knocked me out of the park as far as the TV viewers were concerned. But then you saw what happened when the study came out. It wasn't a high quality study. But meanwhile, he's got the TV cover. And now, many years too late, we have an NTP draft review saying it was not a high quality study. Okay. I've done that. Let's go forward. Now, in the last few days, March 5th, a National Academy of Sciences panel has published a peer review of the NTP, saying essentially that the NTP did not do a good job of supporting their conclusions. And there was no analysis of the scientific studies that the NTP looked at. They were very good studies that they looked at. But they had not handled the protocols of going about a so-called systematic review. Now, since the NTP has come out, the Riddle Study has come out. That's the 300% increase in prevalence of ADHD. And the TIL study with the bottle feeding study. Those two studies are yet to be included. And I think when they are included, there's no way that this critique by the NAS is going to stand. So to cut a long story short, the NTP will have to finalize their draft review. They will have to take into account 2 more and maybe 3 more strong studies from our point of view. And I think if they do it correctly and scientifically, and if there's no interference, we should be completely vindicated. Unfortunately, and then the Grand Gene Review, I mentioned that at the beginning, that's available. A possible mechanism, I've got a few more minutes, I'll just do this quickly. A possible mechanism. How does this work? How does fluoride cause this problem? Well, there's two possibilities for how fluoride may lower the IQ of children. How does it work? Well, the first one is this. When a fetus comes into existence, it has no thyroid gland. I don't think the thyroid gland is developed in the fetus until about 6 months, okay? And it's totally dependent on the mother's production of thyroid hormones for the regulation of its brain development and other tissues. So it's the mother's thyroid hormones that are regulating the baby's development, including their mental development. If there's anything impacting the mother's thyroid function, you have a problem. If you lower the thyroid function of the mother, you'll lower the IQ of the child. Pretty strong. And there was a study done in Canada, again by Malin, found that fluoride exposure increased TSH levels, thyroid stimulating levels, which is a biomarker of underactive thyroid gland. When it's underactive, your TSH levels go up. In those already compromised by low iodine intake. In other words, it didn't, in her study, she couldn't find an effect for all the average people. But when she looked at the subsection of the people that had lowered iodine intake, borderline or outright iodine deficiency, she found the effect. So fluoride makes it worse for a woman who has already got lowered iodine. And Australia has, I think, 40% of women in Australia are borderline iodine deficient. So you have a serious problem here, which fluoride might be making worse. And now, that's the indirect, that's an indirect mechanism. In other words, you're impacting the mother's thyroid, not anything to do specifically with the child's brain. But there's so many ways that fluoride can interfere with the biochemistry of the brain, literally dozens. And for those who are scientists watching this, who really want to follow this up scientifically, I really recommend that you look up this paper by Chen and others, because they offer a very plausible biochemical mechanism. They've got all kinds of animal studies, biochemical studies, to buttress this theory that fluoride upregulates the production of proteins, downregulates some, but the end result is it interferes with the synapse, the synaptic part of the brain, the neuron. The neuron, when it sends signals from one neuron to the next, and it involves injecting chemicals from the first neuron to the second chemical. And it interferes with both the release of these chemicals and the uptake of these chemicals. This is very, very deep, and only somebody who's really up to date in biochemistry can understand this. But this, to me, right now, is the most likely mechanism of how lowly fluoride is interfering with the development of children's brains. And lastly, we have the lawsuit, Fan's lawsuit. In 2016, Fan petitioned the US EPA under the Toxic Substances and Control Act to ban the deliberate addition of fluoride to the drinking water because it poses an unreasonable risk to the majority of people and certainly to a subset of the population. Now, TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act, allows citizens to do this, to petition against the specific use of a specific chemical. And it doesn't say anything about natural fluoride, it just says, we say, you should ban the deliberate addition of fluoride because it's neurotoxic. We went into all the neurotoxic stuff. Now, the interesting thing is we did this in 2016, and you've seen how our case scientifically has really expanded exponentially since 2016 with these government-funded studies done in Canada. Now, the first thing the EPA did was to reject our petition. They had about 60 days, they rejected it. And they made a strategic mistake because what they should have done was to reject our petition based upon jurisdictional grounds. They should have said, it's nothing to do with the TSCA people, the people that do these risk assessments. This is a water division. You send it to the water division. They can change the allowed water levels. Well, we know where that will get us because they've been stalling that for years and years and years with that 1986 4 parts per million is safe, and that's still the standard today. Ridiculous. It's still there. But they rejected it on scientific grounds. They said you don't have a case. Fluoride is not neurotoxic. And they took some of our papers and tried to rebut them. And so we took them to federal court. We are now appealing their rejection. And this is exactly what I've wanted for 24 years. This is going to be a trial of fluoride on a level playing field. The EPA will argue that it's not neurotoxic and not a problem at the levels that we fluoridate. We will argue it is neurotoxic, it is a problem at the levels we fluoridate. And we have some of the world's best experts testifying for us. Howard Hugh, remember Howard Hugh? That was the Bashar study. You remember Bruce Lanphier? That was the green study. We have Philip Grandjean, you've heard about him. We've got some of the world's leading neurotoxicologists involved in our suit. Who have they got? They haven't a single expert from the EPA to testify. They don't have one in the EPA. So they've had to go to industrial consultants to get the typical consultants who argue that every chemical known to man is perfectly safe. So I think we've got a very, very strong case here. It's supposed to go to court on April the 20th. I am due to fly back to the United States on April the 17th. I fly back to the United States, and the trial begins April the 20th. I shall meet my wife in San Francisco, and we will watch my son. My son is the lawyer for our case. My son not only knows the literature, not only did he develop our website and the whole health database, and the whole database for this neurotoxicity, who orchestrated the translation of the Chinese studies, and go on and on and on. But when he mastered all this, it took 8 years. In 2000, he came out to his mum and dad, I'd like to help you with the fluoridation issue. We said, what? Had no idea it was interesting. What, really? What do you want to do? I'd like to develop a web page for you. fluoridealert.org. He did. Did it for 8 years. And then he went to become a lawyer. And having worked for a tort law firm in Los Angeles for a few years, he finally came up with this lawsuit strategy. And he will be the lawyer in charge of this case. Meanwhile, he's got his whole law firm supporting him. It's all pro bono for us. The actual legal side of things, we've had to pay a lot of money to get experts to testify and do depositions and all those things. But we have a very good chance. The only thing we're worried about now is the virus. Will the coronavirus delay this for a year? We don't know. So keep your fingers crossed. Keep watching our webpage. But conclusions. For any community to continue fluoridation with all these studies, including several US government-funded studies and an NTP review, on the table is reckless. The risks to fetal and infant brain development far outweigh any benefit to teeth from ingestion of fluoride during fetal and infant development. Other countries have shown that these benefits can be secured by other means. So that is actually all I have to say. As I said, I've just taken one chunk of all the things which fluoride may be doing to the human body, namely the impact of the infant brain, the fetal and infant brain, and I believe that's enough. I do not think we have to go into another health issues, nor do we have to bring in all the other arguments, but do so if you want to. It's unethical, it doesn't work very well, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, but to me, the showstopper is if we can show that fluoride lowers the mental abilities of our children, it has to stop. And any politician who doesn't help us stop it should be voted out of office. And any regulatory official who continues to muddy the water and not report the science fairly and accurately as the NHMRC, you should get rid of it. Quite frankly, they're not worth it to the taxpayer to pay for this body just to play interference for government policy, to play politics, to play propaganda instead of giving us the straight science. The Australian people, like the New Zealand people, like the Irish people, like the English people, the Canadians and the Americans and the one or two other countries need the health agencies doing their job. We need professionals reading this literature. And one of the reasons that we passed out this sheet, and I hope people that are watching this videotape, is just one page back to back. It goes through all the studies that I've talked about today, and then it gives you all the references. So a special appeal, please, to scientists. Scientists, please read these studies and speak out. Speak out. This is not just time to sit on the fence. Don't allow this to be run by Murdoch newspapers or professional bodies that haven't read this literature, to keep telling the public that it's safe and effective, where these studies show that it's not effective. And I think right now, and this is the reason I'm here in Australia, I think scientists in Australia are letting the people down. You have the training, you have the PhDs in physics and biology and chemistry. You're able to read these studies, and you are able to distinguish between the crap and the science. And I believe that science says that this fluoridation has to stop. But it's not going to stop on its own. There's too many entrenched interests in the public health people, the dentists and the doctors. They've got an entrenched interest in keeping this practice going. It may be to do with pride, it may be to do with reputation, it may be the fear of losing the public's trust. But one last thing. If you're interested in maintaining the public's trust, and what a time to say this, we really need the public's trust in our health bodies and our regulatory bodies. We've seen it with this virus. We need to be able to trust the people that are giving us information. Say, do this, do that, do this. We need to trust them. As more people find out about this, and less scientists and the doctors can work this out and get this message to government, you're going to lose a lot of trust. People are just going to throw their hand. And I don't want to see that happen. I want people to trust scientists. I want people to trust doctors. I want people to trust the dentists. I want people to trust the public health community when they make statements. This fluoridation has driven a horrible wedge between honest science and public health policy. We have to take that wedge away. And please, if you're watching this, if you know any scientists, just give them this bit of paper. Copy this out from the web. You can find it on our webpage, fluorideadhd.org. It's called One Pager on Neurotoxicity. You can also find it on Fluoride Free Australia. And one other thing to do, please sign up to get the newsletter from this new organization, Fluoride Free Australia, who started with the bang. They're currently running 15-second TV ads on this, warning pregnant women. Have you seen, anybody in this room seen those ads? They've been showing in the Bunbury area. Anyway, so please get the newsletter. This is, if you like, this is the revitalization of the anti-fluoride movement in Australia. With that, thank you very much for watching and listening.